It was brilliant. It sparkled. It was funny. It was again totally relevant. I think this is the key, that all of the characters in it are they're larger than life characters, but they're all people that we can recognize in today's society.
For I am blithe and I am gay, while they sit sighing night and day. For I am blithe and I am gay. Tra la 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 la. Tra la 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 la. Tra la 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 la.
Something as simple as "I cannot tell what this love may be" from Patience, which when I hear it, every time I hear it, I cannot get it out of my head. The model of a great tune is where the next note is inevitable, the second after you've heard it. You know, it's that kind of, you know, it's how did they do that? And it's easy to dismiss it and say, well, that's very simple. That's a pleasant tune, but it's very simple. But it's the memorability, and Sullivan had that in spades. It was just a natural gift.
Having harnessed Gilbert and Sullivan, their producer, Richard D'Oyly Carte, dreamed up two extremely lucrative sidelines. One was to license amateur productions of Gilbert and Sullivan's operas, which not only had to hire D'Oyly Carte parts and prompt books, but also had to be performed exactly as at the Savoy, the theatre he built on Gilbert and Sullivan's success, and where the company moved during the run of Patience in 1881. Which meant that many amateur performers bought tickets again and again to see the operas so that they could learn the productions at first hand. The other lucrative sideline, starting with HMS Pinafore, was to introduce children's morning performances. That is, performances in which all the parts were played by children. Which sold tickets by the dozen not only to doting relatives and friends, but also proved extremely popular at the box office with a much wider audience, mostly women and children, who were still uncomfortable about going to the theatre in the evenings. D'Oyly Carte sent grudging members of the adult casts to learn from their youngers. The International Gilbert and Sullivan Festival has its own youth production.
What's not to love about Gilbert and Sullivan? Our slogan says it's fun, it's friendly, and it's for all the family. And I think that sums it up.
This year's youth production is Patience.
If you ever see a young person, I'm talking sort of perhaps 10, around that age, 8 to 10 and so on, and if you can just observe them after they've been on stage, they're transported. They're like sort of halfway to heaven, with great stars in their eyes, and they come out dancing and singing down the road. They carry it on into their lives.
When I was about 12, 13, I played the part of Patience in our school production. In those days, it was an all-male school. We didn't have any girls, so we all had to cross-dress in order to fill the roles. Yes, I played the part of Patience, and had the honour of kissing the abbot's ring at the end of the performance. So that was a great honour in those days. So, I mean, yes, it was a great performance, but I remember in particular on the very last performance, Bunthorne insisted on going overboard with the final embrace and kiss. He told me it was tradition to do so. I began to wonder, looking back on it, whether in fact that kiss which he implanted on my lips at the time was unnecessary, but in fact it went down very well apparently with all the boys in the college.
Patience is a child of nature who becomes embroiled in the world of high art. So far, Gilbert had avoided pillorying the church, but Patience was to have been based on his ballad, The Rival Curates. With an eye to his respectable audience, though, he decided the church might be too holy a cow to risk ridiculing, so Rival Poets it became. The aesthetic craze was an irresistible target, and pretentiousness in art was no less preposterous than the self-importance of the army, the navy and the law that he'd already targeted. His main worry was persuading the gentlemen's chorus to shave to look sufficiently aesthetic, so he cast them as dragoon guards instead, in love with aesthetic maidens. Grossmith played the pretentious poet Bunthorne, who, like Sir Joseph in Pinafore, is a bachelor pursued by a chorus of adoring women, but this time they all have amorous designs on him. But whether based on Swinburne, Whistler, Rossetti or Oscar Wilde, Bunthorne significantly pursues the only girl he knows he's unlikely to get, Patience. Gilbert's writing was quite an influence on Oscar Wilde. Gilbert's play Engaged reads almost as a prototype for the importance of being earnest. And D'Oyly Carte now sent Oscar Wilde on a lecture tour of the United States, a clever piece of marketing that explained to America in advance exactly what it was that Patience was satirizing. When the going gets tough at the end of the opera, Bunthorne almost has to pair off with the most devoted and least palatable of his admirers, Lady Jane. That she then jilts him for a duke is actually a happy escape for Bunthorne. Lady Jane bemoaning her fading charms to her own cello accompaniment is one of the highlights of the piece.
To make up for lost time as best she may.
The poets are mercilessly lampooned, but so too are the sheep-like worshippers of celebrity, or, as it would have been, the worshippers of religious leaders. Bunthorne's rapturous maidens sublimate their unrequited love into the solidarity of worship, while Patience is perfectly happy until she falls in love. Gilbert's detractors claim that he couldn't, or wouldn't, write about love, but his exploration of emotional issues in Patience is very revealing, both about himself and about his relationship with Sullivan. Gilbert, who had a room in his house called the Flirtorium, was clearly fascinated by young girls, perhaps because they posed no sexual threat, just as he was obviously uncomfortable with the sexuality of older women. The overripe Lady Jane pursues Bunthorne, who in turn pursues the innocent and unavailable Patience. But Bunthorne turns out actually to be asexual, contented with a tulip or lilac. And perhaps there's something of Gilbert in him. One of Gilbert's early plays, The Wicked World, imagined a society without sex, and he married Lucy, or Kitty as he called her, a very much younger woman with whom perhaps significantly he had no children. Gilbert clearly understood the pain of mature women, and Sullivan, a great womanizer, knew magnificently how to set that pain to music.
There will be too much of me in the coming by and by.
Grosvenor, Bunthorne's rival, gets the girl, as Sullivan always tended to, and it was Grosvenor's pretty maiden that Sullivan's devoted patron, Queen Victoria, chose as her party piece. The similarities between Bunthorne and Grosvenor and Gilbert and Sullivan don't end there. Bunthorne admits that he writes not for art's sake, but in order to be popular.
In short, my medievalism's affectation, born of a morbid love, of admiration.
And he longs to drop his popular image, just as Gilbert resented being recognised only as a comic writer. Bunthorne and Grosvenor are forced into an uncomfortable, pragmatic collaboration. Bunthorne persuades Grosvenor to dumb down, just as Sullivan complained that his collaboration with Gilbert forced him to, but ironically, that dumbing down makes Grosvenor, as it made Sullivan, even more popular.
Come walk up and purchase with avidity.
overcome your diffidence
and natural timidity.
The same night that the GNS Festival sees the youth production of Patience in Buxton, I'm very excited to be singing Bunthorne in Patience at the BBC Proms, here at the Albert Hall, under the great conductor Sir Charles Mackerras.
I think that Sullivan was an immensely talented musician. I've always thought that the trouble with him was that he was rather lazy. Whereas you see Mozart and Handel and those sort of people had to work at red-hot speed and had to get things finished in order to live. Sullivan was, by the time particularly that his operas were being performed everywhere, was used to go to the races with his upper-class friends and everything like that, which of course Gilbert didn't like. I mean, Gilbert was very jealous of that. And I think that Sullivan just decided that he was so clever that he would leave things to the last minute. And I mean, it's famous that he composed the second act of the Mikado in one night and orchestrated it in one sitting up all night, while all the cast was waiting. Sir Arthur, we must have the second act. How are we going to rehearse it otherwise? And how are we going to be ready for the opening night next week?
When Bunthorne, i.e. Gilbert, has to cajole and bully Grosvenor, i.e. Sullivan, he discovers that Lady Jane, while she may not be his ideal fantasy figure, is a loyal ally, just as Gilbert discovered that using a woman as a go-between, most particularly Helen Lenoir, D'Oyly Carte's then secretary and later his wife, was usually the most effective way of settling things with Sullivan.
Move! Move! And that's what I shall say. Bah! Bah!
Sullivan was now relying less on operatic parody and was daring to include in comic operas music of the kind that brought admirers of his more serious music into the theatre for the first time.
I actually don't know many Gilbert and Sullivan shows. I'm actually more an opera person myself, and but I've been encouraged by friends, and I'm here with a friend from Scotland, so yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Patience is closely connected with Oscar Wilde, and I quite like his poetry and his stories, and yeah, well, actually everything. So it was one of the prompts I really was looking forward, because it's not played very often, I think.
Meanwhile, the GNS Festival here in Buxton is full of pleasure seekers with stamina. They've all just seen one Gilbert and Sullivan in the Opera House, and they're now off to a late-night sing-through of Iolanthe. Though the company had moved from the unsatisfactory Opera Comique to D'Oyly Carte's newly built Savoy Theatre during the run of Patience,
Iolanthe was the first of what were to become known as the Savoy Operas to open at the first theatre in the world to be entirely lit by electricity.
in Iolanthe, Grossmith was assigned the famously tricky Nightmare song, which provided the title of Jeff Clark's play about a fictional D'Oyly Carte understudy. The play shows how difficult it can be to explain Gilbert and Sullivan's topsy-turvy logic to the uninitiated.
Gilbert?
Yes.
Does she love you?
No. And she has agreed to give her heart to a high-ranking member of the House of Lords, and she doesn't care which.
Well, she's a strumpet. She's just after a title.
Exactly.
Well, you want to be careful of lasses like that. Look what happened to me in Pickles.
She's very, very pretty.
Oh, I saw her, Pickles.
Well, I don't get her in the end anyway.
Oh, you see reason, do you?
No. My long-dead wife turns up and announces that she's, well, not dead after all.
Well, where's she been all this time?
Hiding. At the bottom of a stream. She's a fairy.
Oh.
And we have a son, Strephon, who's, well, half a fairy. And he ends up marrying Phyllis.
So having started off by saying she were going to marry someone from the House of Lords, she ends up with half a fairy?
That's about it.
Do people pay a lot to come and see this?
A show like Iolanthe, maybe now, knowing that this is more than a century old, knowing that we're viewing it through the filter of the passage of time, what it has to say about parliamentary government would feel fresh and amusing again. The score most certainly has spirit and life in it.
Sullivan started work on this marvellous score within days of his mother's death. He had to work quickly, and he poured his feelings into his setting of Gilbert's lyrics about the pain of a long-lost mother and wife. But both Gilbert and Sullivan can then seamlessly slip into low comedy.
I never knew Gilbert was such a dirty bugger.
When tempests wreck thy bark, and all is drear and dark, if thou shouldst need a knock, I'll give thee one.
What was that?
I heard the minx remark she'd meet him after dark inside St. James's Park and give him one.
The satire shocked many of the critics, but D'Oyly Carte was able, the moment the curtain fell, to cable New York, where it was opening 5 hours later, that it was a huge popular hit. Gladstone thought the parliamentary satire was hilarious and immediately put the wheels in motion for Sullivan's knighthood. Significantly, Gilbert had to wait until Queen Victoria was well and truly dead before he got his. He was way ahead of his time in suggesting that brains were more important than breeding in the House of Lords.
I don't want to say a word against brains. I have a great respect for brains. I often wish I had some myself. But with the House of Peers composed exclusively of people of intellect, what's to become of the House of Commons?
I never thought of that.
This comes of women interfering in politics.
Which always gets a good laugh and is always cited by Gilbert's most hatchet-faced feminist detractors as evidence of his true reactionary nature. But it does, of course, refer to the fact that the Fairy Queen has just elected a fairy member to promote a very sensible new egalitarian system for Parliament.
Titles shall ennoble then all the common council men. Peers shall teem in Christendom, and a duke's exalted station be attainable by competitive examination.
The contralto, though still a comic role, is given a new dignified status as the Fairy Queen. Gilbert takes another swipe at legal corruption. The Lord Chancellor alters the letter of the law to reverse its meaning, to arrive at a happy ending. All the fairies marry mortals. With more dignity than Lady Jane in Patience had shown, the Fairy Queen has resisted the temptation to fall down and worship the burly guardsman. But now she conveniently finds that her immortality can only be saved by turning him into a fairy guardsman and marrying him. The distinguished conductor Jane Glover played the Fairy Queen in Iolanthe when she was at Oxford University with John Owen Edwards, and they still share an enthusiasm for Sullivan.
All the parody, I think, has got that wonderful seriousness behind it, which is why it's so good.
Yes.
And I don't know, you're the expert, but this isn't the two I've done since I, as it were, grew up. I just feel that one has to take the parody very seriously and do it with the seriousness with which he wrote it, and then it comes off.
I agree. I think you can't do the opening of Iolanthe unless you really believe it is a Midsummer Night's Dream.
Exactly.
You can't do it. It doesn't work.
Exactly.
Jane Glover conducted a famous Iolanthe at the Proms, and also English National Opera's controversial Princess Ida.
Oh, it was a bit of a dog's breakfast.
A bit of a dog's breakfast. A very, very fabulous cast. I mean, the cast to die for.
Yes, it was. But lost.
Lost in a production concept that should perhaps remain anonymous.
Yes.
Princess Ida wasn't a huge success in 1884 either, and it's difficult to know quite why.
Certainly it wasn't an original play. It was based on Gilbert's perversion of Tennyson's Princess, which had been Gilbert's first major theatrical success. So perhaps the already existing characters didn't feel tailor-made for the now established D'Oyly Carte favourites. It also resorted, in neatly satirising sexual politics, to a bit of temporary gender swapping, which Gilbert had very publicly forsworn. And he daringly sustains the tension by allowing the cross-dressing to cross over into a serious scene.
Unreal, its loveliest hue, alas, we quite agree with you, alas, we quite agree with you. Unreal, its loveliest hue, unreal, its loveliest hue.
Sullivan hadn't really wanted to write another comic opera. His claim that he always had to subjugate his music to Gilbert's lyrics is a little disingenuous if you look particularly at some of the serious music in Iolanthe and Princess Ida. The patter songs, of course, were lyric-led and only required a sort of musical trampoline. But you only have to look at any parody of a G&S patter song to realise how musically alive Sullivan's are in comparison. But whatever Sullivan's plans were, on the very day Iolanthe had opened, the basket in which he had invested all his financial eggs was bankrupted, and from having been a very rich man, he was left with only a few £100 in the bank. So Princess Ida had to be composed. And it's a glorious score. There's nothing grudging or hack-like about it. Sullivan was a very generous, forgiving man. A few days after his financial disaster, his fur-lined coat disappeared from the green room, and it turned out to have been stolen by a dresser who'd pawned it for £2 to pay for the birth of his 7th child. Sullivan accepted the guiltily proffered pawn ticket, but also gave the man £5 to buy something for the mother and baby.
Gently, gently, evidently, we are safe so far. After scaling fence and paling, here at last we are.
Both Gilbert and Sullivan present Ida as an entirely serious person, who is defeated not because dwindling into a wife is the happy ending to which all women should aspire, but because she is a woman ahead of her time.
When I was going to do the Princess Ida for the first time in London, I had just produced my first baby. And again, they were wanting to fit me in the costume. And I kept saying, no, I can't, because I'm pregnant. Anyway, I went along and took my little son, Jason, with me, in a carry cot in the corner. Busy mum, you know. Had my pictures taken. And he started crying. So I said to the photographer, I'm awfully sorry. I said, I'll have to pick him up. And he snapped me with my little son. Now, point is, first of all, Princess Ida has sworn never to go near a man. So this needs some explanation. And don't forget, they were engaged at the age of 1, and Hilarion is trying to get in to see her. So I don't know how she's going to explain this child she's clutching.
Back in 1884, other musical plays were enjoying much longer runs than Princess Ida had managed, and if he wasn't even going to make money out of comic opera anymore, Sullivan again insisted it was time to break up the partnership. Gilbert's determination that a plot driven by the magical powers of a lozenge was the answer did nothing to persuade him.
The speed with which he'd had to compose and score Princess Ida had nearly killed Sullivan. Ida's great I Built Upon a Rock was composed after battling home through a blizzard in the middle of the night at the end of the dress rehearsal, and he only managed to conduct the first night by injecting himself with a hefty dose of morphine. He couldn't face all that again.
An uneasy relationship with Gilbert had become increasingly bitter, and though he had a contract with Gilbert and Carte, he felt justified in dishonouring what he saw as the cause of his own betrayal of his potential.
Oh, faithless rock, my simple faith to mock. Oh, traitorous oak, thy worthlessness to cloak, thy worthlessness to cloak.
With Sullivan determined to compose no more comic operas, would the Savoy now have to survive on a diet of Gilbert and Sullivan revivals? Had there indeed been no more Savoy operas, Gilbert would have been surprised to see Patience being revived well over a century later. He thought its topicality would make it a very short-lived success. Well, at the Royal Albert Hall, tonight's prom of Patience has just finished. How did the prommers enjoy it?
I've always liked Gilbert and Sullivan, and that exceeded all my expectations. A great performance in every way.
Yeah, my first time watching GNS, and yeah, great experience, really, really good.
Absolutely superb. A great evening.
Great. I have to say, I didn't think for a minute that my 13 and 15-year-old children, who were kind of dragged along, I didn't think they'd love it, and they absolutely loved it. So perhaps this is a younger audience coming up.
A wonderful evening, and the audience was ecstatic, as well they should be.
Gilbert needn't have worried. Every time Patience reappears, it hits a new target.
What Bunthorne and Grosvenor were the pop stars of their day. You know, there are these aesthetic poets poncing around the place, and they could easily be swapped with rock pop stars poncing around the place, and one thinks they're the bee's knees, and then another one person comes along and steals their fans. But you get the one dedicated, and it points up the absurdity of celebrity.
Oh,